Case 1. Warren Jeffs. Warren Jeffs seemed like an unlikely figure to command absolute power over thousands of lives. Soft-spoken and reserved, he rose to lead the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints after his father's death in 2002. What made his case stand out was not just the crimes he committed, but the iron grip he maintained over his followers even from behind prison walls. The FLDS had broken away from mainstream Mormonism over a century earlier, clinging to the practice of polygamy long after the larger church had abandoned it. By the time Warren Jeffs took control, the group operated from twin communities straddling the Arizona-Utah border, places locals simply called Short Creek. Jeffs inherited more than just a religious organization. He inherited a system where the prophet's word was treated as the voice of God himself. Jeffs used that authority in ways that would ultimately bring him before a Texas jury. He arranged marriages between adult men and girls as young as 12, calling them spiritual unions blessed by divine revelation. For followers raised to believe that questioning the prophet meant losing eternal salvation, resistance was unthinkable. Young girls were told that submitting to these marriages was their pathway to heaven. The FLDS operated largely unseen for years, its communities isolated and insular. But in 2006, Jeffs made the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list after fleeing charges that he had facilitated illegal child marriages. He was captured in Nevada that August during a routine traffic stop, ending 2 years on the run. Utah prosecutors convicted him in 2007 as an accomplice to rape for arranging the marriage of a 14-year-old girl to her 19-year-old cousin. The conviction was later overturned by the Utah Supreme Court due to flawed jury instructions. Jeffs would face justice again, but this time in Texas, where the evidence against him was overwhelming. In 2008, authorities raided the Yearning for Zion Ranch in El Dorado, Texas, an FLDS compound Jeffs had established. They removed more than 400 children. What investigators found inside was disturbing. Records documented marriages involving underage girls. A massive bed had been constructed in the temple, used in rituals Jeffs claimed were sacred ceremonies. The Texas case centered on 2 victims. DNA evidence proved Jeffs had fathered a child with a 15-year-old girl. Even more damning was an audio recording seized from the ranch. On it, Jeffs could be heard directing the sexual assault of a 12-year-old child bride, describing the act as a religious ritual meant to bring her closer to God. At trial in 2011, prosecutors played that recording for the jury. Jeffs had chosen to represent himself after firing multiple attorneys. He offered little defense, at one point declaring that God would strike down the court if proceedings continued. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On August 4, 2011, Warren Jeffs was convicted on 2 counts of sexual assault of a child. The sentencing phase began immediately. Prosecutors presented evidence of more than 600 additional instances of wrongdoing, building a portrait of systematic abuse spanning years. The jury took less than 30 minutes to decide his punishment. Jeffs received life in prison plus 20 years. He was also fined $10,000. The sentence ensured he would never leave prison alive. He was transported to the Lewis C. Powledge Unit near Palestine, Texas, where he remains today. 7 other FLDS men were convicted in Texas on similar charges, receiving sentences ranging from 6 to 75 years. The legal proceedings exposed a pattern of abuse that had flourished for decades under the guise of religious freedom. But the story did not end with Jeffs behind bars. Reports indicate he continues to lead the FLDS from his prison cell, issuing instructions through phone calls and written messages. Current members still regard him as their prophet, believing his conviction was persecution for his faith. His brother Lyle handles day-to-day operations, but followers maintain that Warren remains their spiritual authority. In 2019, attorneys for Jeffs argued he had suffered a mental breakdown and was no longer competent to give testimony in civil cases. Yet, investigators say he continues to exert control over the remaining FLDS community, which has dwindled but remains devoted. The group's rigid structure has only intensified under his direction from prison, with some reports suggesting even stricter rules about relationships between husbands and wives. The case forced uncomfortable conversations about the boundaries of religious freedom. Courts had to balance constitutional protections with the fundamental rights of children. The outcome established that religious belief cannot justify the sexual exploitation of minors, no matter how sincerely held those beliefs might be. For the victims, the impact has been profound and lasting. Elissa Wall, one of the women whose cooperation helped secure Jeffs' conviction, spoke publicly about the long-term effects of the abuse. She noted that an entire society had created Warren Jeffs, enabling his rise through decades of conditioning followers to accept absolute obedience to prophetic authority. The 2022 Netflix documentary, Keep Sweet, Pray, and Obey, brought renewed attention to the case, offering detailed accounts from former FLDS members who escaped the group. The series revealed the psychological control mechanisms that kept members compliant and the immense courage required for victims to come forward. Even today, legal battles continue over FLDS properties and assets. Governments in Utah and Arizona have worked to dismantle the organizational structure that allowed abuse to flourish unchecked. The twin towns of Hilldale and Colorado City, once entirely controlled by the FLDS, have slowly begun integrating with the outside world. The memory of Warren Jeffs continues to influence discussions about religious extremism in America. His case demonstrated how isolated communities can foster environments where abuse becomes systematic, protected by layers of religious authority and enforced silence. The investigation revealed that warning signs had been overlooked or dismissed for years, with multiple opportunities to intervene missed by authorities who were reluctant to interfere with religious practices. Jeffs' conviction stands as a reminder that no claim of divine authority places anyone above the law. For the children born into the FLDS and subjected to Jeffs' edicts, justice came late, but it came. The question that haunts the case is how many lives might have been spared if someone had acted sooner, before the prophet's word became an instrument of harm rather than hope. Case 2. Dylann Roof. On June 17, 2015, members of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, gathered for their Wednesday evening Bible study. The church, known as Mother Emanuel, was a cornerstone of the Black community, one of the oldest African Methodist Episcopal churches in the South, with a history stretching back to 1816. That night, a 21-year-old white man with a bowl haircut joined the small group in the fellowship hall. His name was Dylann Roof. He was quiet, withdrawn, and sat through nearly the entire hour-long study without saying much. The congregation welcomed him warmly. They had no reason to suspect what he was planning. Roof had driven to Charleston from Columbia that afternoon with a specific purpose. He had researched historic Black churches and chosen Mother Emanuel deliberately. He knew its significance. He understood what it represented, and that was precisely why he was there. As the study drew to close around 9:00 p.m., the group of 12 stood and closed their eyes for a final prayer. Pastor and State Senator Clementa Pinckney, 41 years old, led the prayer. Roof kept his eyes open. He reached into his fanny pack and pulled out a .45 caliber Glock pistol he had purchased 2 months earlier with birthday money. He opened fire. Survivors later described the sound, gunshots echoing through the small room, people falling, screams cutting through the prayer. Roof moved methodically through the space, shooting victims multiple times. When his magazine emptied, he reloaded and continued. He fired approximately 77 rounds in less than 6 minutes. Reverend Pinckney was shot first. Cynthia Hurd, 54, a librarian for 31 years, died shielding others. Susie Jackson, 87, the oldest victim, was killed alongside her nephew. Tywanza Sanders, 26, the youngest victim, who tried to reason with Roof and talk him down. Ethel Lance, 70, a church sexton for 3 decades, died at her post. DePayne Middleton Doctor, 49, a minister herself, was killed. Myra Thompson, 59, died in the same room where she had taught Bible study for years. Daniel Simmons, 74, a retired pastor, succumbed to his injuries at the hospital. Sharonda Coleman Singleton, 45, a pastor and high school track coach, was murdered while attending her regular Wednesday study. 3 people survived by playing dead or hiding under tables. One survivor, Polly Shepard, later testified that Roof told her he was letting her live so she could tell the world what happened. Before fleeing, Roof allegedly told the room, "I have to do it. You rape our women, and you're taking over our country, and you have to go." Within hours, surveillance footage from the church and nearby businesses helped investigators identify the suspect and his vehicle. By the next morning, Roof's face was everywhere. On June 18th, approximately 14 hours after the shooting, he was captured during a traffic stop in Shelby, North Carolina, about 250 miles north of Charleston. Inside his car, police found the murder weapon and additional ammunition. Investigators quickly uncovered Roof's online footprint. He had created a website called The Last Rhodesian, filled with a racist manifesto and photographs of himself posing with Confederate flags and at former slave plantations. In his writings, Roof expressed admiration for white supremacist ideologies and apartheid-era governments. He described being radicalized after researching the Trayvon Martin case online and consuming white nationalist propaganda. His stated goal was to start a race war. Friends later told investigators that Roof had talked about his racist beliefs for months. He had made comments about wanting to shoot people at the College of Charleston. He had been arrested in February 2015 for drug possession and in April for trespassing at a mall after being banned. Despite these arrests and concerning behavior, no red flags prevented him from purchasing the firearm used in the massacre. The federal trial began in November 2016. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including surveillance footage, ballistics reports, and Roof's own confession. He had admitted to FBI agents that he specifically chose Emanuel AME because of its historical significance to the black community. He wanted his actions to inspire other white supremacists. Roof fired his defense attorneys and represented himself during the sentencing phase. He showed no remorse. He never apologized. He called no witnesses and presented no mitigating evidence. When given the opportunity to address the jury, he told them he felt he had to commit the murders and that nothing was wrong with him psychologically. The jury convicted him on all 33 federal charges, including hate crimes and obstruction of the practice of religion. In January 2017, he became the first person sentenced to death for a federal hate crime. Later that year, Roof pleaded guilty to 9 counts of murder in state court, receiving 9 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Throughout the legal proceedings, something extraordinary happened. At Roof's bond hearing just days after the massacre, family members of the victims addressed him directly. One by one, they spoke of their grief and their forgiveness. "I forgive you," said Nadine Collier, daughter of 70-year-old Ethel Lance. "You took something very precious away from me. I will never get to talk to her ever again. But I forgive you and have mercy on your soul." The moment was broadcast around the world, sparking conversations about grace, faith, and the power of forgiveness in the face of unthinkable evil. But forgiveness did not mean forgetting. The families also made clear they wanted justice. They wanted the world to understand what had been taken from them, not just 9 lives, but 9 pillars of a community. Reverend Pinckney had been a state senator working to pass body camera legislation for police. Cynthia Hurd had touched thousands of lives through her work at the library. Susie Jackson had been a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Each victim had left an irreplaceable hole. The shooting forced uncomfortable truths into public conversation. In its immediate aftermath, South Carolina removed the Confederate flag from the State House grounds, ending decades of controversy. Retailers across the country stopped selling Confederate merchandise. The case reinvigorated national debates about hate crimes, domestic terrorism, and the symbols of the Confederacy. The Emmanuel AME congregation, though devastated, refused to let hatred win. The church reopened for services just 4 days after the massacre. Thousands attended, filling the sanctuary and spilling onto the streets. They sang, they prayed, they mourned, and they demonstrated resilience. A hateful person came to this community with some crazy idea he'd be able to divide, but all he did was unite us, said Charleston Mayor Joseph Riley. Today, Dylan Roof sits on federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, awaiting execution. His appeals have been unsuccessful. In 2021, a federal appeals court upheld his conviction and death sentence, finding that he was competent to stand trial and that his self-representation, while unwise, was knowing and voluntary. The memory of the Mother Emanuel 9 lives on through memorials, and scholarships, and continued advocacy for racial justice. The Church itself remains active, a testament to the strength of faith in the face of terror. Every June 17th, Charleston pauses to remember the 9 souls taken during a moment of prayer. 9 people whose only crime was welcoming a stranger into their place of worship. The case stands as a stark reminder of the persistence of racial hatred in America and the ongoing threat of domestic terrorism. But it also demonstrates the enduring power of communities to respond to violence with dignity, to answer hate with love, and to ensure that the names of the victims are remembered long after the killer's name fades into deserved obscurity. Even today, the name Emmanuel, which means God with us, continues to inspire. Mother Emanuel remains a symbol of resilience and faith, a church that survived slavery, earthquakes, and an attempt by a white supremacist to start a race war. The doors remain open, the welcome remains warm, and every Wednesday evening the congregation still gathers for Bible study. Case 3. Paul Schaefer. In 1961, a German preacher named Paul Schaefer arrived in Chile with a vision. He told Chilean authorities he wanted to create a charitable agricultural community for German immigrants, a place of dignity and hard work in the foothills of the Andes Mountains. The conservative government of President Jorge Alessandri welcomed him, granting permission to establish the Sociedad Benefactora y Educacional Dignidad, the charitable and educational society Dignity. What Schaefer didn't tell them was that he was fleeing. Back in Germany, he faced criminal charges for sexually abusing 2 children in his care. Rather than face justice, he had gathered his followers and fled across the ocean to start fresh. Chile would give him that chance. It would take more than 4 decades before he faced consequences. Schaefer was born in 1921 in Troisdorf, Germany. He joined the Hitler Youth as a young man and served as a medic in the Wehrmacht during World War II, reaching the rank of corporal. After the war, he established a children's home and Baptist ministry, positioning himself as a man of faith and service. But in 1959, when allegations emerged that he had sexually abused children under his care, Schaefer created the private social mission and began planning his escape. He followed the teachings of American preacher William Branham, who advocated strict biblical adherence, apocalyptic visions, and a woman's duty to obey. Branham had predicted an imminent nuclear war that would devastate Western nations, and Schaeffer may have used this prophecy to convince his congregation that South America offered salvation. In 1961, Schaeffer purchased a 4,400-acre ranch near the town of Parral, about 340 kilometers south of Santiago. Over the next several years, more than 300 German followers made the journey to Chile in waves, 230 in 1963, with additional groups arriving in 1966 and 1973. What they built was unlike any ordinary community. Colonia Dignidad eventually sprawled across 137 square kilometers, surrounded by barbed wire fences and equipped with watchtowers and searchlights. From the outside, it appeared to be a productive agricultural operation. The colonists ran a school and hospital that served surrounding rural communities, offering free education and health services. This goodwill created local support and made it harder for authorities to investigate what happened behind the wire. Inside, Schaeffer ruled with absolute control. He separated children from their parents, housing them in dormitories away from their families. He preached that he alone had a direct line to God, that leaving the colony meant eternal damnation, and that obedience to him was obedience to divine will. Members worked long hours in the fields with little rest. They were forbidden from having contact with the outside world. Women were kept subservient, marriages were controlled, and any dissent was crushed. Most devastatingly, Schaeffer used his power to systematically abuse children. He molested boys within the colony for decades, often multiple victims at a time. He also lured Chilean boys from nearby farming families to the colony's school and medical clinic, where he sexually assaulted them as well. The abuse was persistent, organized, and protected by a network of loyalists who helped him maintain control. But Colonia Dignidad's darkness extended far beyond Schaeffer's personal crimes. In 1973, General Augusto Pinochet seized power in Chile through a military coup. Pinochet's dictatorship would last until 1990, and during those years, thousands of political opponents were disappeared, tortured, and executed. Colonia Dignidad became one of the regime's tools. Investigations by Amnesty International and Chile's National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation later confirmed that the colony served as a secret detention and torture center for Pinochet's intelligence service, DINA. Political prisoners were brought to the compound, held in underground bunkers, subjected to brutal interrogation, and in many cases executed. Their bodies were disposed of, and their families were left with no answers. Schaeffer and his inner circle were not merely bystanders, they actively collaborated, providing logistical support, interrogation techniques, and a remote location where screams would go unheard. The colony also became a hub for weapons smuggling and possibly a refuge for Nazi war criminals. Its connections to the dictatorship gave it a protective shield. Local authorities were instructed not to interfere. Anyone who asked too many questions was silenced. Yet cracks began to appear. In 1967, Heinz Kuhn escaped from the colony and corroborated earlier allegations of abuse. In the late 1980s, Georg and Lottie Packmore fled and testified before the German parliament that colonists were held against their will. In 1997, 2 teenage boys escaped to the German embassy. One, Tobias Müller, was flown to Germany, where he became an activist working to expose Schaeffer's crimes. Finally, in 1996, after 26 Chilean children who had attended the colony's clinic and school reported abuse, a judge in Santiago issued an arrest warrant for Schaeffer. By this time, Chile had transitioned to democracy following Pinochet's departure in 1990, and the protective political shield was gone. But when police arrived at the compound to arrest him, Schaeffer had vanished. He had staged a farewell ceremony with tears and embraces, then disappeared into a network of secret tunnels and bunkers beneath the colony. For years, he lived as a fugitive, moving between hidden locations. The colony continued to function, though support from local families dwindled as the truth became harder to deny. Schaefer communicated with his followers through coded messages, maintaining control even in hiding. His life on the run lasted nearly a decade. In March 2005, Argentine police arrested Schaefer near Buenos Aires. He was 83 years old, frail, and still defiant. He was extradited to Chile to face justice. The trial revealed the staggering scope of his crimes. Schaefer was convicted on 20 counts of child abuse and 5 counts of child rape, all committed between 1993 and 1997. While the convictions covered only a fraction of his decades of abuse, they were enough. In May 2006, he was sentenced to 33 years in prison, longer than he would ever live to serve. Schaefer spent his final years in Santiago's ex-penitentiary hospital. He was also under investigation for his involvement in the 1976 disappearance of political activist Juan Maino and the alleged murder of Russian mathematician Boris Weisfeiler, who vanished near Colonia Dignidad in 1985. But those cases remained unresolved. On April 24, 2010, Schaefer died of heart failure at age 88. He had served just 4 years of his sentence. His death did not end the reckoning. In the years following his conviction, 26 other members of Colonia Dignidad's leadership were convicted of child abuse, torture, and other crimes. Hartmut Hoppe, Schaefer's right-hand man and the colony's doctor, fled to Germany in 2011 and has lived there ever since despite Chilean requests for his extradition. Germany eventually acknowledged its failure to protect its citizens in Chile, and in 2016 the German foreign minister admitted that the government had done nothing for 3 decades while its citizens were abused and tortured on Chilean soil. Since 2018, Germany has paid damages to more than 100 victims. Chile also confronted its complicity. The government took control of the property, which was renamed Villa Baviera. Today, it operates as a tourist destination, offering visitors a glimpse into its dark history while attempting to integrate the remaining residents into Chilean society. Former colonists, many now elderly and lacking formal education, struggled to rebuild their lives. Most receive minimal pensions, as Colonia Dignidad only began paying taxes to the state in the 1990s. The full extent of what happened at Colonia Dignidad may never be known. Victims have estimated that Schaefer abused hundreds of boys over his decades of control. The number of political prisoners who died there remains uncertain, as records were destroyed and bodies were hidden. What is certain is that 2 governments, one authoritarian, one democratic, allowed Schaefer to operate with impunity for far too long. The case raises difficult questions about the intersection of religious authority, political power, and international responsibility. How does a known child abuser flee one country and gain protection in another? How does a religious commune transform into a torture center with government approval? Why did Germany turn a blind eye while its citizens were enslaved and abused in a foreign land? And how many more children could have been saved if someone had acted sooner? Colonia Dignidad stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority within closed communities. Schaefer created a kingdom where he was God, judge, and executioner. He used faith as a weapon, isolation as a prison, and collaboration with evil regimes as a shield. For more than 40 years, he hurt children, destroyed families, and aided a dictatorship's campaign of terror, all while hiding behind the language of charity and religion. The survivors, many still traumatized decades later, continue to seek acknowledgement and justice. They want the world to remember what happened in that isolated valley in southern Chile, to understand how easily faith can be twisted into control, and to recognize that places claiming to be havens can become hells. Schaefer died in prison, but his victims live with the consequences of his crimes every day. Their courage in finally speaking out brought him down and ensured that the name Colonia Dignidad would forever be associated not with dignity, but with one of the darkest chapters in the history of religious abuse. Case 4. Tony Alamo. In the 1970s and 1980s, if you saw a celebrity wearing an elaborately decorated rhinestone-studded jacket, there was a good chance it came from Tony Alamo's design studio. Elvis Presley wore his creations. So did Michael Jackson, who appeared on the cover of the album Bad in a black leather jacket designed by Alamo. The preacher-turned-designer had built a multi-million-dollar fashion empire, and his Tony Alamo Christian Ministries seemed to embody the American dream wrapped in religious fervor. But behind the glittering jackets and apocalyptic sermons, Tony Alamo was building something else entirely. He was collecting wives, dozens of them, many of them children. And by the time federal agents raided his compound in Arkansas in 2008, investigators would uncover a pattern of abuse spanning more than a decade, involving girls as young as 8 years old. Tony Alamo was born Bernie Lazar Hoffman on September 20, 1934, in Joplin, Missouri. He was Jewish by birth but converted to Christianity and reinvented himself as a street preacher. In the 1960s, he began evangelizing in Los Angeles alongside his wife, Susan, attracting young people, hippies, and those drawn to his extremist messages. The couple founded Tony Alamo Christian Ministries in 1969, and the organization quickly grew. Alamo preached a mixture of apocalyptic Christianity, virulent anti-Catholicism, and homophobia. He told followers that leaving the church meant burning in hell. He warned that the end times were imminent and that only those loyal to him would be saved. The ministry became financially successful through various businesses, gas stations, a hog farm, restaurants, and the celebrity jacket design operation. Followers worked long hours for little or no pay, and the profits funded Alamo's lavish lifestyle and expanding compound. In 1975, the organization moved its headquarters to Arkansas, establishing a 300-acre compound in Dyer. Later, Alamo would create additional locations in Fouke, Arkansas, as well as compounds in Oklahoma and New Jersey. For years, the organization operated with minimal outside scrutiny. But in 1982, everything changed. Susan Alamo died of cancer. Alamo's response was bizarre and disturbing. He told followers that Susan would be resurrected, and he had her body placed in a crypt on the compound. For months, devotees prayed over her remains, waiting for a miracle that never came. Former members later described this period as a turning point, the moment when Alamo's behavior shifted from authoritarian to unhinged. It was after Susan's death that Alamo began taking multiple wives. He declared that God had authorized polygamy and that young girls were fit for marriage. When asked about the age of consent, Alamo had a ready answer that he would later repeat to the Associated Press. Consent is puberty. He conducted secret ceremonies in which he married young girls, some as young as 8 years old. One victim testified that she exchanged wedding vows with Alamo when she was just 9. Another said she became his wife at age 8. These were not symbolic ceremonies, they were preludes to sexual abuse. Alamo transported these girls across state lines to various ministry locations where he sexually assaulted them. He kept candy and Barbie dolls in his bedroom, tokens he used to manipulate and groom his child victims. Former followers described an atmosphere of total control. Alamo used fear, manipulation, and religious authority to keep his congregation obedient. Children were routinely beaten for minor infractions. Families who tried to leave were threatened. Dissent was crushed swiftly, And behind it all, Alamo continued his abuse, protected by a wall of devoted followers who either believed his justifications or were too terrified to speak out. But cracks began to form. In 1991, an 11-year-old boy told police he had been paddled 140 times by 4 men on Alamo's orders at the ministry's compound in Saugus, California. Prosecutors eventually dropped the charges, citing the passage of time. That same year, Alamo was charged with threatening to kidnap a federal judge in Arkansas. A jury acquitted him. Then came the tax case. The IRS had been investigating Alamo's financial operations for years. In 1992, Special Trial Judge Larry L. Namaroff ruled that Tony Alamo Christian Ministries was operated essentially for Tony and Susan's private benefit, not as a legitimate, tax-exempt religious organization. From 1994 to 1998, Alamo served 4 years in federal prison for income tax evasion. He later claimed he was imprisoned for preaching the gospel, casting himself as a martyr. After his release, Alamo moved to a new compound in Fouke, Arkansas, in the southwestern part of the state near the Texas border. About 100 followers lived with him there. It was during this period, from 1994 to 2005, that federal prosecutors would later prove he committed the crimes that would send him to prison for life. The investigation intensified in September 2008, when about 100 state and federal law enforcement officers raided the Fouke compound following allegations of child pornography and child abuse. 6 girls aged 10 to 17 were taken into temporary state custody. The raid drew national media attention, and former members began coming forward with horrifying accounts of life inside the ministry. Authorities charged Alamo with 2 counts of taking underage girls across state lines for sex in 2004 and 2005. As the investigation continued, more victims were identified. A new indictment unsealed in November 2008 charged him with 8 additional counts, covering 4 more underage girls and a span of 14 years. In subsequent court hearings, the details emerged. An 18-year-old man testified about beatings inflicted by another church member. A 14-year-old girl testified that Alamo touched her inappropriately while she showered and that she was beaten by one of his enforcers. She described being deprived of food for 3 to 7 days as punishment. Investigators discovered that Alamo had married one girl when she was about 9 years old in 2000. Another girl said she was 11 years old in 2003 when she married Alamo and was forced to have sex with him. State officials attempted to remove more than 100 additional children from the Alamo compound in November 2008, but found none there. However, 3 children were taken into custody when they attended a court hearing. 17 more children were found in 2 SUVs being driven toward Texas, attempting to flee Arkansas jurisdiction. They were also placed in state custody. 6 more children in Indiana, associated with Alamo's church, were placed in foster homes. The trial began in July 2009 in federal court in Texarkana, Arkansas. Prosecutors called 5 women who testified that they were children when Alamo subjected them to secret ceremonies and forced them into marriages. They described years of sexual abuse, manipulation, and control. The testimony was devastating. Alamo showed no remorse. In a phone interview with CNN the year before, he had called the accusations a hoax. "They're just trying to make our church look evil by saying I'm a pornographer, saying that I rape little children," he said. "I love children. I don't abuse them." The jury didn't believe him. After more than 8 hours of deliberations, they convicted him on all 10 federal counts of transporting minors across state lines for sex. Each count carried a maximum sentence of 10 years. At sentencing on November 13, 2009, U.S. District Judge Harry F. Barnes imposed the maximum, 175 years in federal prison, each sentence to be served consecutively. Alamo was also fined $250,000. In January 2010, the court ordered him to pay $2.5 million in restitution to his victims, which he never paid. Assistant U.S. Attorney Christopher Plumlee welcomed the sentence. Given the number of victims and the difficult type of testimony they had to provide in order to get to trial, it's gratifying for them to see him get this sentence, he said. Judge Barnes had harsher words for Alamo. At sentencing, he told the 75-year-old predator, "One day you will face a higher and a greater judge than me. May he have mercy on your soul." Alamo filed an appeal, but it was unsuccessful. He spent his remaining years in federal custody, moving between facilities as his health declined. He suffered from diabetes and had a heart attack in 2011. By 2017, his condition had deteriorated significantly. On May 2, 2017, at age 82, Tony Alamo died at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. He had served just over 7 years of his 175-year sentence. The Bureau of Prisons did not disclose the specific cause of death, though he had been suffering from multiple serious health conditions. Even after his death, the legal battles continued. The federal government had filed suit in 2013 to seize 27 parcels of property, either owned or controlled by Alamo, seeking to use the assets to compensate his victims. Many of the properties were eventually forfeited. The impact of Alamo's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom. Former members struggled to rebuild their lives after years or decades inside an authoritarian religious group. Many of the children who grew up in the ministry had received minimal formal education. Some had never learned to function in the outside world. Organizations that help people leave cults worked with survivors, but the psychological scars ran deep. Terry Purvis, mayor of Fuq, summed up the community's feelings after Alamo's death. "There's no telling how many little girls' lives he destroyed," he told the Associated Press. "I wouldn't want to be in his shoes right now." The Tony Alamo case exposed how celebrity status and religious authority can create a shield for predators. For years, Alamo's fame as a designer and his charisma as a preacher allowed him to hide in plain sight. His followers believed he was a man of God. The world saw the glittering jackets and heard the fiery sermons. Few looked closely at what was happening to the children. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of young people in closed religious communities. When a leader claims divine authority, when leaving means eternal damnation, when the outside world is portrayed as evil and dangerous, children have no escape. They are taught to obey without question. They are told that abuse is holy, and they are silenced by fear, shame, and isolation. Tony Alamo Christian Ministries is now defunct. The compounds have been seized or sold. The celebrity jackets are relics of a different era. But the survivors carry their trauma forward. Some have found healing through speaking out, through advocacy work, through ensuring that their stories are heard. Others struggle in silence. What remains is a cautionary tale about the danger of mixing fame, faith, and unchecked power. Tony Alamo used religion to justify the sexual exploitation of children. He used his celebrity to gain credibility. He used isolation and fear to maintain control. And for more than a decade, he got away with it, transporting child after child across state lines, conducting mock marriages, keeping Barbie dolls by his bedside, all while telling anyone who would listen that he was doing God's work. The judge was right. Tony Alamo would eventually face a higher judge. But for the little girls whose childhoods he stole, for the families he destroyed, for the lives he shattered, no amount of earthly or divine judgment can restore what was taken. The best that justice could offer was ensuring he died in prison, that his name would forever be associated with his crimes, and that his victims would finally be believed. In a world where predators often escape consequences, where children's voices are too often ignored, that verdict mattered. It still does. Case 5. John Fate. On the evening of April 16, 1960, Holy Saturday, the day before Easter, 25-year-old Irene Garza told her family she was going to Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen, Texas, for confession. It was a routine act of faith for the devout young woman. She taught second grade at an elementary school, had been crowned Miss South Texas, and was beloved in her community. She planned to return home quickly to help prepare for Easter Sunday. She never came back. Irene's family grew concerned when hours passed with no word. By the next morning, panic had set in. Easter Sunday came and went with no sign of her. Volunteers organized the largest search in Rio Grande Valley history up to that point, combing through fields, neighborhoods, and waterways. For 5 agonizing days, Irene's family and the community held on to hope. On April 21st, searchers found Irene's body floating face down in a canal. An autopsy revealed the horrifying truth. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted while unconscious, and suffocated. The cause of death was asphyxiation. She had been bound and gagged. Her killer had taken her from a house of God and subjected her to unthinkable violence. Investigators immediately focused their efforts on finding answers. They questioned about 500 people across several Texas cities, including known sex offenders, Garza's family members, co-workers, and ex-boyfriends. They conducted nearly 50 polygraph examinations. Local businessmen posted a $10,000 reward, an unprecedented sum for a murder case in the valley at that time. One name kept surfacing: Father John Bernard Fate. Fate was a 27-year-old priest who had recently completed his seminary training in San Antonio and was assigned to Sacred Heart Church. He admitted to investigators that he had heard Irene's last confession that evening, not in the confessional booth, but in the church rectory. He said she left after their conversation, and the last time he saw her, she was standing outside the church. He denied any involvement in her disappearance or death. But evidence suggested otherwise. Church members reported that Fate's confession line had moved unusually slowly that night and that he had been away from the sanctuary several times. When the canal was drained days after Irene's body was discovered, investigators found items that belonged to the church, including a candelabra. They also found a metallic Kodak slide photo viewer with a long cord, and it belonged to Father Fate. The cord could have been used to bind the victim. When police administered polygraph tests to Fate, he failed. The results indicated deception. Investigators grew more suspicious when they learned something deeply troubling. Just 3 weeks before Irene's murder, another young woman had been sexually assaulted at a nearby Catholic church while kneeling at the communion rail. Maria America Guerra had been attacked on March 23, 1960. The case had initially been shrouded in rumor and silence. Church leaders discouraged people from considering that a priest could be responsible for such violence. But Guerra later identified her attacker as Father John Fate. He was charged with rape, and the trial ended in a hung jury. Rather than face a second trial in 1962, Fate entered a plea of no contest to a misdemeanor charge of aggravated assault. He paid a $500 fine and faced no prison time. Shortly after the legal proceedings in the Guerra case, Fate was quietly sent away. Church officials transferred him to Assumption Abbey, a Trappist monastery in Missouri. He spent time at treatment centers for troubled priests in New Mexico and at monasteries in multiple states. Years later, he would leave the priesthood entirely, marry, move to the Phoenix area, and raise 3 children. He worked for 17 years as a volunteer at the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, a food charity. To all outward appearances, John Fate had become a respectable family man, but Irene Garza's murder remained unsolved. Her family never stopped asking questions. Her cousins, Noemi Ponce Sigler and Linda de la Viña, became fierce advocates for justice, keeping Irene's case alive when others moved on. They pressured authorities, contacted media, and refused to let the case fade into history. For decades, rumors swirled in McAllen and beyond. People whispered about a conspiracy, about a cover-up involving the Catholic Church and local law enforcement. The theory went that officials had decided protecting the church's reputation was more important than prosecuting a priest, especially in 1960, when most elected officials in Hidalgo County were Catholic and Senator John F. Kennedy, a Catholic, was running for president. The case went cold. Witnesses died. Detectives retired. Evidence gathered dust. By the turn of the century, it seemed John Feet would never face justice. Then, in 2002, the case was reopened. The Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit agreed to re-examine the evidence. That same year, something extraordinary happened. A former monk named Dale Tacheny decided he could no longer keep a secret he had carried for 4 decades. In 1963, 3 years after Irene's murder, Feet had been sent to the Trappist Monastery in Iva, Missouri. There, according to Tacheny, Feet confessed to killing a young woman. Tacheny later told investigators and CBS's 48 Hours what Feet had described. He had assaulted a woman in her early 20s around Easter after hearing her confession. He bound her, gagged her, and later moved her to another location. He placed her in a cellophane bag and put her in a bathtub. As he left, he could hear her saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." When he returned, she was dead. He disposed of her body along a roadway. Tacheny wrote to police, initially thinking the murder had occurred in San Antonio where Feet had trained. The information was passed to Texas Rangers investigator Rudy Jaramillo, who made another shocking discovery. Another priest, Joseph O'Brien, who had worked with Feet in 1960, also came forward. While O'Brien had previously told a television program he knew nothing about the murder, he admitted to Jaramillo that Feet had confessed to him shortly after the crime. 2 priests independently reported that John Feet had confessed to murdering Irene Garza. But the Hidalgo County District Attorney at the time, Rene Guerra, refused to take the evidence to a grand jury. He said it was insufficient. There was no DNA, no recent confession, and the witnesses' accounts were old. When public pressure forced him to convene a grand jury in 2004, Guerra never called the 2 priests as witnesses. The grand jury declined to indict Feet. Joseph O'Brien died in 2005. Irene's family felt hope slipping away again. Then 48 Hours correspondent Richard Schlesinger investigated the case. In 2014, he tracked down John Feet at his home in Arizona and confronted him on camera. Feet, now an elderly man, denied killing Irene Garza. He appeared puzzled by the continued interest in a case from 1960. Shortly after the 48 Hours episode titled The Last Confession aired, a new district attorney was elected in Hidalgo County. Ricardo Rodriguez had campaigned in part on a promise to reopen the Irene Garza case. He kept that promise. In February 2016, 56 years after Irene's murder, John Bernard Feet was arrested in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was 83 years old. At his first court appearance, using a walker to steady himself, Feet told the judge he was confused. "This whole thing makes no sense to me because the crime in question took place in 1960, he said. He refused to waive extradition and had to be transported back to Texas through legal proceedings. The trial began in December 2017 in the Hidalgo County Courthouse in Edinburgh. After 6 days of testimony and more than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury heard from 22 prosecution witnesses and reviewed evidence nearly 60 years old. Prosecutors presented the faded green Kodak slide viewer, autopsy photos, and testimony about 3 other South Texas women whom Feet had allegedly attacked or had disturbing interactions with in churches. They built a case showing Feet had a pattern. He targeted young women in high heels from behind while they prayed. Dale Tacheny, now in his 80s, was the star witness. He recounted Feit's confession from 1963, his voice steady despite his age. The defense argued that the evidence was insufficient, that too much time had passed, that witnesses' memories were unreliable. On December 7, 2017, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of murder with malice. John Feit stood stone-faced as the verdict was read. He showed no emotion. The sentencing phase began the next day. Remarkably, it snowed that morning along the Texas-Mexico border, a rare occurrence that some saw as symbolic. Feit's defense attorney asked for probation, citing his lack of felony convictions since Garza's death and his advanced age. Prosecutors asked for 57 years, one for each year that justice had been delayed. The jury sentenced him to life in prison. Prosecutors Michael Garza and Christine Ramon embraced Irene's family members, some of whom wept with relief. District Attorney Rodriguez, who had kept his campaign promise, held them close. Noemi Ponce Seigler and Linda de la Viña, who had fought for 57 years, finally had their answer. Feit was transferred to the W.J. Estelle unit near Huntsville, Texas. His attorneys filed an appeal but struggled to meet deadlines. In November 2018, the appeals court warned that if no brief was filed within 10 days, the appeal would be dismissed. The appeal eventually failed. On February 13, 2020, John Feit was found unresponsive in his cell. He was pronounced dead at a hospital. The preliminary cause was cardiac arrest. He was 87 years old. He had served just over 2 years of his life sentence. The trial had exposed uncomfortable truths about institutional failure. Prosecutors presented evidence that church officials and elected law enforcement authorities had suspected Feit killed Irene, but chose not to pursue the case aggressively. A letter recovered via subpoena from the Archdiocese of San Antonio and the Diocese of Corpus Christi suggested that protecting the church's reputation had been a priority. With most local officials being Catholic and Kennedy's candidacy making Catholic issues politically sensitive, the decision to shield Feit may have been strategic. Adding to the tragedy, after leaving the priesthood, Feit had worked as a supervisor tasked with clearing priests for assignments to parishes. One of the men he helped clear was James Porter, who was later convicted of sexually assaulting more than 100 victims, including children. The Garza family released a statement after Feit's death. The abduction and murder of Gretchen has forever altered our family, and we miss her every single day. We are grateful for the continual pursuit of justice by law enforcement. For Irene's community, the conviction brought closure but also reflection. The case became a symbol of how institutions can prioritize self-preservation over justice, how victims' families must sometimes fight for decades to be heard, and how cold cases, no matter how old, can be solved when investigators refuse to give up. Dale Tacheny, the monk whose testimony had been crucial, spoke to Richard Schlesinger after the verdict. "The debt is paid, both to Irene and to Father Feit," he said. "Justice has been done for both of them." Irene Garza's grave in McAllen remains a place of remembrance. Her story has been told in documentaries, books, and countless news articles. She is remembered not just as a victim, but as a vibrant young woman, a teacher who loved her students, a beauty queen who charmed her community, a devout Catholic who went to confession on Holy Saturday and never came home. Sacred Heart Catholic Church still stands in McAllen. The building has witnessed much history, but April 16, 1960, remains its darkest day, the day a young woman sought spiritual guidance and instead encountered a predator. For 57 years, John Feit walked free while Irene's family waited for justice. It took the courage of 2 priests to break their silence. the persistence of a family who refused to forget, the dedication of investigators who reopened a cold case, and a community that demanded accountability. The case raises questions that extend far beyond one murder in South Texas. How many other cases were buried to protect institutional reputations? How many victims never saw justice because their abusers wore collars? And how long must families wait before the truth is acknowledged? John Feet is gone now, but Irene Garza's legacy endures. Her name has become synonymous with the fight for justice delayed but not denied, with the power of families who refuse to stop asking questions, and with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the people we trust most, those who hear our confessions, who claim to represent God, are the ones we should fear. In the end, Irene got her day in court. It took 57 years, but she got it, and that matters more than words can express. Case 6. Maury Davis. On January 27, 1975, an 18-year-old named Maury Davis committed an act of violence so brutal that prosecutors immediately sought either the electric chair or life in prison. He stabbed 54-year-old Joella Lyles, a Sunday school teacher, with such ferocity that he nearly decapitated her. It was a senseless, drug-fueled attack that devastated a family and shocked the Nashville community. 50 years later, Maury Davis would be known by a very different title: Senior Pastor of Cornerstone Church, a megachurch in Madison, Tennessee with nearly 5,000 members. His transformation from convicted killer to religious leader remains one of the most controversial redemption stories in American Christianity, a case that forces difficult questions about forgiveness, rehabilitation, and whether some acts place a person forever beyond certain roles in society. Maury Davis was barely an adult when he committed murder. At 18, he was deep into drug abuse and living a chaotic life. By his own later accounts, he was under the influence of drugs and in a severely unstable mental state when he encountered Joella Lyles. The details of the attack itself have been kept relatively private out of respect for the victim's family, but court records show the violence was extreme. Davis used a knife to stab Lyles repeatedly, inflicting wounds so severe that he nearly severed her head from her body. When police arrested him, Davis was incoherent. At trial, his defense team argued that he had been insane at the time of the killing, that heavy drug use had rendered him incapable of forming the intent necessary for a murder conviction. Davis himself blamed the devil, drugs, and mental illness. He claimed he had no memory of committing the act, that he had been completely out of his mind. Prosecutors weren't buying it. They wanted Davis to face the ultimate punishment. Tennessee still had the death penalty in 1975, and the brutality of the crime seemed to warrant it. At minimum, they argued, Davis should spend the rest of his life behind bars. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. It was a savage attack on an innocent woman whose only role in life had been teaching children about faith. But the jury ultimately convicted Davis not of murder, but of manslaughter. The distinction was significant. Murder requires malice aforethought, a deliberate intent to kill. Manslaughter, while still a serious felony, suggests a killing that occurred without premeditation, often in the heat of passion or under circumstances that reduce culpability. The maximum sentence for manslaughter in Tennessee at that time was 20 years. Davis received the maximum. Then something happened that Davis would later describe as life-changing. While sitting in jail awaiting sentencing, he claimed to have had a religious conversion. He said he found God behind bars, that he accepted Jesus Christ as his Savior, and that he was transformed from the inside out. It's a familiar narrative in Christian circles, the jailhouse conversion, the sinner who meets God at rock bottom. Skeptics often dismiss such conversions as convenient timing, a ploy to gain sympathy from parole boards or to shed the guilt of terrible actions. But Davis maintained that his faith was genuine. Over the years he spent incarcerated, he studied the Bible, attended chapel services, and began speaking to other inmates about redemption. By the time he was released after serving his sentence, Davis had decided his life's work would be ministry. In the years following his release, Davis didn't hide his criminal past. He spoke openly about having been convicted of manslaughter, about the darkness of his drug-addicted youth, about the violence he had committed. He framed his story as a testimony to the transforming power of faith, proof that no one is beyond redemption, that God can use even the worst sinners for good. In 1985, Davis married a woman named Gail, whom he had met at a church in Irving, Texas, where she worked as the pianist. They would go on to have 4 children, triplets born in 1986 and a son born in 1994. To all appearances, Davis had built a stable, loving family life. In 1991, Davis and his wife decided to start a church in Nashville. Rather than pioneering a new congregation from scratch, Davis was elected senior pastor of an existing 200-member church in the suburbs. His charisma, preaching ability, and compelling personal story attracted followers. Under his leadership, the church grew exponentially. Over the next 25 years, Cornerstone Church would swell to nearly 5,000 members, becoming one of the larger congregations in the area. Davis became a fixture on In Focus, a weekly religious television show broadcast regionally on Nashville's News Channel 5 CBS affiliate and via satellite throughout Africa and Europe on the Faith Broadcasting Network. He wrote books, gave speeches, and positioned himself as a voice of hope for those struggling with addiction, crime, and despair. His message was consistent. If God can change me, He can change anyone. Many people found Davis's story inspiring. Recovering addicts saw in him proof that change was possible. Families of incarcerated loved ones clung to his testimony as evidence that prison didn't have to be the end of someone's story. Church members appreciated his transparency about his past and believed his transformation was genuine. But not everyone was convinced. Critics, including victims' rights advocates, some members of the clergy, and people who knew Joe Ella Lyles, questioned whether a man who had nearly decapitated a Sunday school teacher should be leading a church. They argued that while forgiveness might be appropriate, and while Davis had every right to rebuild his life, becoming a megachurch pastor was a step too far. The Bible, they pointed out, sets high standards for church leadership. 1 Timothy 3 outlines qualifications for overseers and deacons, including being above reproach. Titus 1 says an elder must be blameless. While these passages have been interpreted in various ways, many Christians believe that certain actions, particularly violent crimes, should disqualify someone from pastoral leadership, regardless of subsequent repentance. There is also the question of the victim's family. Joe Ella Lyles never got a second chance. She never got to teach another Sunday school class, never got to see grandchildren grow up, never got to live the decades that Maury Davis has lived. While Davis built a family, a career, and a congregation, the Lyles family was left with an absence that could never be filled. Some wondered whether Davis's public platform, his celebrity in Christian circles, added insult to their injury. Davis has addressed these concerns over the years, though not extensively. He has said he takes full responsibility for his actions, that he carries the weight of what he did, and that his ministry is built on the foundation of personal transformation. He has emphasized that he doesn't minimize his crime or seek to escape accountability. Rather, he uses his past as evidence of God's grace. After 25 years of leading Cornerstone Church, Davis retired from active pastoral duties. He now works as a public speaker, church consultant, and life coach. His legacy is complicated. To his supporters, He represents the possibility of redemption and the power of second chances. To his critics, he represents a justice system that treated a brutal killing as manslaughter, allowed a killer to serve a relatively short sentence, and permitted that killer to rise to prominence in religious leadership. The Maury Davis case raises uncomfortable questions that don't have easy answers. Should someone who has committed a violent crime ever be allowed to hold a position of spiritual authority? If we believe in rehabilitation, what does that mean practically? Where is the line between offering forgiveness and maintaining appropriate boundaries? And how do we balance the rights of the repentant with the pain of those who lost loved ones? Different faith communities answer these questions differently. Some churches have policies prohibiting anyone with a violent felony conviction from serving in leadership. Others take a more individualized approach, believing that genuine transformation should not permanently exclude someone from service. There's no consensus, and perhaps there can't be. What's undeniable is that Jo Ella Lyles paid the ultimate price for Maury Davis's actions on January 27, 1975. She was a Sunday school teacher, a woman who spent her time teaching children about love, kindness, and faith. She died violently at the hands of a teenage drug addict who, by his own admission, was out of his mind on substances and under the influence of darkness he couldn't control. Davis has lived nearly 50 years since that day. He has raised a family, led a church, written books, and influenced thousands. He has, by all accounts, lived a law-abiding life since his release from prison. He has not reoffended. He has built something positive from the wreckage of his youth. But the question remains, is redemption the same as restoration to leadership? Can a person be forgiven without being given a pulpit? Should the gravity of taking a human life, especially in such a brutal manner, place permanent limits on the roles a person can hold, even if they've changed? These aren't just theological questions. They're practical ones that churches, parole boards, and communities face regularly. The Maury Davis story is unique in its specifics, but the pattern is common. Someone commits a serious crime, claims transformation, serves their time, and seeks to rejoin society in a meaningful role. How we respond says as much about us as it does about them. For some, Davis's story is a beautiful testament to grace, proof that no one is beyond hope, that change is real, and that God can use anyone. For others, it's a troubling example of how easily society can move past horrific violence when the perpetrator is charismatic and claims faith. Jo Ella Lyles' family has largely stayed out of the public eye. They haven't campaigned against Davis or sought media attention. Their grief has been private. They're healing their own. But their silence shouldn't be mistaken for approval or closure. The absence of public protest doesn't mean the wound has healed. As Maury Davis continues his work as a speaker and consultant, his case continues to provoke reflection. Churches considering hiring someone with a violent past must grapple with whether Davis's trajectory should be seen as a model or a cautionary tale. Victims' families watching other cases unfold must wonder whether justice was truly served. And society at large must consider what we believe about punishment, redemption, and the possibility of change. There are no perfect answers. A man committed a terrible crime as a teenager. He served his sentence. He claimed transformation. He built a life and a ministry. Thousands of people have been influenced by his message. And a Sunday school teacher named Jo Ella Lyles never came home. Both of those realities exist simultaneously. How we hold them together, with what balance of grace and accountability, mercy and memory, hope and caution, may say more about our own values than about Maury Davis himself. What's certain is that his story will remain controversial, that the questions it raises won't be easily resolved, and that Jo Ella Lyles deserves to be remembered not just as the victim in someone else's redemption story, but as a person whose life had value that was violently stolen away. In the end, whether you see Maury Davis as a testament to God's transforming power or as evidence that some roles should remain closed to those who have committed certain acts, likely depends on where you stand on fundamental questions about justice, mercy, and what we owe to both the living and the dead. Case 7. James Ray Gary. For decades, James Ray Gary was a pillar of the West Oakland community. He was a Vietnam War veteran who had served his country, a retired carpenter who had worked with his hands his entire life. And most notably, he was the deacon of Olive Branch Missionary Baptist Church, a small church he and his father had built together in the late 1960s, brick by brick, beam by beam. To his congregation, Gary was a man of God. To his neighbors, he was a respected elder. To investigators, he would eventually become something else entirely, a suspected serial killer who had hidden in plain sight for more than 40 years. The first murder happened in 1981. Latrell Lindsay was killed in Union City, California, a working-class community in the East Bay. Her death was brutal, and investigators worked the case hard, but leads went nowhere. DNA technology was still in its infancy. Without witnesses or physical evidence that could be processed with the tools of the time, the case eventually went cold. Lindsay's family was left with grief and no answers. 16 years later, and nearly 50 miles away, another woman was murdered. Winifred Douglas was killed in Vallejo in 1997. Like the Lindsay case, Douglas's murder was violent and appeared to be the work of someone with a capacity for extreme cruelty. Investigators in Vallejo had no reason to connect her death to a killing that had happened in a different city nearly 2 decades earlier. They worked their own leads, conducted their own interviews, and eventually, they too hit a wall. The Douglas case went cold. For years, the 2 murders existed as separate tragedies in separate jurisdictions. The families mourned. The cases sat in file cabinets. And James Ray Gary continued living his life in West Oakland, attending church services, greeting parishioners, and maintaining his reputation as a faithful servant of the Lord. But DNA doesn't forget, and DNA doesn't lie. As technology advanced, cold case units across California began re-examining old evidence. In both the Lindsay and Douglas cases, DNA had been collected from the crime scenes. When investigators finally ran the samples through modern databases and compared them to each other, they made a stunning discovery. The DNA matched. The same person had killed both women, 16 years and 50 miles apart. Now they had a serial killer. They just didn't know who he was. The DNA profile sat in the system, waiting for a match. Years passed. Then, in late 2021, something happened that would crack the case wide open, but it had nothing to do with the murders. A woman living on the streets of Fairfield, California, reported to police that she had been sexually assaulted. She gave investigators a description of her attacker, but didn't know his name. 6 months later, in 2022, the same woman came forward again. She had been assaulted a second time, and this time she had learned the identity of her attacker. His name was James Ray Gary. He was an elderly man, a deacon of a church in West Oakland. Police took her report seriously. When they ran Gary's name through their systems, something caught their attention. James Ray. Gary had lived at the same address in Union City where Latrell Lindsay had been murdered in 1981. He had lived there for 7 years. It was too significant to be a coincidence. Detectives launched an undercover surveillance operation. On July 8, 2022, a team followed Gary as he drove around Fairfield in his Ford Taurus. They watched as he stopped his car in the 1300 block of West Texas Street and spoke to the same woman who had accused him of rape. After the brief interaction, Gary got back in his car and drove away. What happened next sealed his fate. Gary was driving so erratically that police had probable cause to pull him over on suspicion of drunk driving. It was a routine traffic stop, except that every move was being watched and documented. After the stop, officers collected items Gary had touched: a water bottle, the steering wheel, anything that might contain his DNA. The samples were rushed to the lab. When the results came back, investigators finally had their answer. James Ray Gary's DNA matched the DNA found at both the Lindsay murder scene in 1981 and the Douglas murder scene in 1997. Police sat Gary down and informed him of the evidence against them. Court records indicate that his DNA, not just similar but an almost certain match, had been found at two murder scenes decades apart. Gary was 79 years old. His past addresses included San Ramon, Oakland, Vallejo, and Union City. He had moved around the Bay Area over the decades, and everywhere he went, violence seemed to follow. On July 21, 2022, James Ray Gary was formally arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. The man who had spent his life serving as a church deacon, who had built a house of worship with his own father, was now sitting in Santa Rita Jail in Dublin, California, facing accusations that he had lived a double life for more than 40 years. The arrest sent shockwaves through the West Oakland community. Members of Olive Branch Missionary Baptist Church struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the charges against him. How could someone who preached about love and redemption be accused of such violence? How could a man who had built a church, literally constructed it with hammer and nails, be capable of murder? But the evidence was damning. Gary's DNA linked him definitively to both crime scenes. His history of living at the Union City address where Lindsay was killed was established. The woman in Fairfield had identified him as her attacker, and her bravery in coming forward had led police to investigate him in the first place. Investigators began re-examining everything they knew about Gary's life. He was a retired carpenter, so he had the physical skills and strength to carry out violent attacks. He was a Vietnam War veteran, which meant he had been exposed to violence and trauma. He had been married twice. His second wife had died before his arrest. And, crucially, his past addresses placed him in the exact locations where the murders occurred at the exact times they occurred. The timeline was chilling. In 1981, Gary was living in Union City when Latrell Lindsay was murdered there. By 1997, he was connected to Vallejo when Winifred Douglas was killed. And in 2022, when he was 76 years old, he was allegedly still committing sexual assaults in Fairfield. If the allegations are true, Gary had been a predator for at least 41 years, possibly longer. The case also revealed how sexual assault victims, particularly vulnerable women, are often dismissed or not believed. The woman in Fairfield who reported Gary had been living on the streets. She was marginalized, easy to ignore, but she persisted. She came forward not once, but twice. And because detectives took her seriously, because they followed up on her report, 2 cold case murders were finally solved. Alameda County District Attorney's Office moved forward with the charges. In court filings, they detailed the DNA evidence linking Gary to both murders and outlined the decades-long investigation that had finally led to his arrest. They also noted the sexual assault allegations from Fairfield, which established a pattern of violent behavior toward women. Gary remains in custody at Santa Rita Jail, awaiting trial. At 79 years old, he faces the possibility of spending whatever time he has left behind bars. His attorneys will have the difficult task of explaining how his DNA ended up at 2 murder scenes, 16 years and 50 miles apart, if he is innocent. The defense has not yet outlined its strategy, but the DNA evidence will be nearly impossible to overcome. For the families of Latrell Lindsay and Winifred Douglas, the arrest brought a bittersweet mixture of relief and renewed grief. Relief that someone had finally been charged, that their loved ones had not been forgotten. Grief because decades had passed, because they had lived with unanswered questions for so long, and because no arrest could bring back what had been taken. The case raises deeply troubling questions about how predators can hide in communities, even in places of faith. James Ray Gary wasn't just a church member. He was a leader. He was a deacon, someone entrusted with spiritual authority and community respect. He had built the church with his father, a fact that gave him even more credibility and trust. People looked up to him. They sought his counsel. They never suspected that the man who stood before them on Sundays might have murdered 2 women and assaulted others. It's a pattern that appears again and again in cases of hidden predators. They position themselves in places of trust and authority. Teachers, coaches, youth ministers, deacons, pastors, these roles provide access to victims and a shield of respectability. When someone is seen as a pillar of the community, accusations against them are met with disbelief. Not him, people say. He would never. But DNA doesn't care about reputation. DNA doesn't care about titles or positions in the church. DNA tells the truth about who was at a crime scene, regardless of what facade the person has constructed. The Gary case also demonstrates the power of modern forensic science to solve cold cases. In 1981 and 1997, DNA technology existed but was limited. Databases were small, processing was slow, and many cases simply couldn't be solved with the tools available at the time. But as technology advanced, as databases grew, and as cold case units went back through old evidence with new techniques, answers emerged. Across California and throughout the country, cold cases are being reopened and solved because of DNA. The Golden State Killer was caught in 2018 through genetic genealogy. Countless rape and murder cases from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s are being closed because investigators are re-examining evidence with tools that didn't exist when the crimes were committed. For James Ray Gary, that meant that the passage of time was not protection. He may have thought he had gotten away with murder twice. He may have believed that building a life of respectability, serving as a church deacon, and reaching old age would shield him from consequences. But 41 years after the first murder, DNA caught up with him. As Gary awaits trial, the Olive Branch Missionary Baptist Church he helped build still stands in West Oakland. It's a small congregation, and the arrest of their longtime deacon has been devastating. Some members struggle with whether to continue attending, whether the building itself has been tainted by association with Gary's alleged crimes. Others see the church as separate from the man, a place of worship that existed before him and will exist after him. The trial, when it comes, will be closely watched. Prosecutors will present the DNA evidence, Gary's connections to the locations where the murders occurred, and the testimony of the woman in Fairfield whose courage led to his arrest. The defense will have an opportunity to challenge the evidence, to present alternative explanations, and to argue that Gary is innocent until proven guilty. But the DNA evidence is powerful. It's the kind of evidence that is difficult to explain away. And for the families of Latrell Lindsay and Winifred Douglas, it represents something they've waited decades to see. Proof, accountability, justice. James Ray. Gary built a church with his father in the late 1960s. He built it with wood and nails and labor. He built it as a place where people could come to worship, to find community, to seek God. For more than 50 years, that church stood as a testament to Gary's standing in the community, to his apparent devotion to faith, to his public image as a man of God. But if the allegations are true, Gary also built something else, a facade, a carefully constructed public persona that hid a darker reality. And while the church he built still stands, his reputation has crumbled. The deacon who was supposed to serve others is accused of preying on women. The veteran who served his country is accused of becoming a murderer. The respected elder who built a house of worship allegedly used that respect to hide crimes that spanned 4 decades. The case is still pending. Gary is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. But the DNA evidence is there, waiting to be presented to a jury. And if that jury convicts, James Ray Gary will spend his final years not as a respected church deacon, but as a convicted murderer who finally ran out of places to hide. Case 8. David Zandstra. On the morning of August 15, 1975, 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington left her home in Marple Township, Pennsylvania, to walk to summer Bible camp. It was a short walk, a familiar route, and a safe errand, or so her family believed. The camp was held at 2 churches in the area, the Reformed Presbyterian Church, where Gretchen's father served as pastor, and the Trinity Church Chapel Christian Reformed Church, where a man named David Zandstra was the pastor. Gretchen never arrived. When she failed to appear at her father's church, panic set in quickly. Gretchen was a responsible child, not one to wander off. Her father, Pastor Harrington, became concerned immediately. It was David Zandstra who called the police to report Gretchen's disappearance. As the pastor responsible for running opening exercises at Trinity and transporting children between the 2 churches, Zandstra would have noticed if Gretchen hadn't shown up. He presented himself as a concerned colleague, a fellow pastor worried about the missing daughter of a neighboring minister. Searchers combed through Marple Township, a small community about 15 miles west of Philadelphia. Volunteers walked through neighborhoods, knocked on doors, and searched wooded areas. Days turned into weeks. Hope began to fade. About 2 months later, on October 10, 1975, Gretchen's skeletal remains were discovered in Ridley Creek State Park, not far from where she had disappeared. The discovery devastated her family and the community. An 8-year-old girl who had simply been walking to Bible camp had been murdered and discarded like trash in the woods. Investigators questioned hundreds of people. They looked at known sex offenders in the area. They investigated family members, neighbors, anyone who might have had contact with Gretchen. David Zandstra was interviewed during the initial investigation. He was, after all, one of the pastors running the Bible camp where Gretchen had been headed. But investigators didn't have enough evidence to charge him, and the case eventually went cold. Zandstra left Pennsylvania shortly after Gretchen's murder. He moved to Plano, Texas, and later to Marietta, Georgia. He left the ministry, married, and raised 3 children. For nearly half a century, he lived his life, while the Harrington family lived with an unsolved murder and unanswered questions. The case haunted the Marple Township community. Police officers who had worked the investigation never forgot Gretchen's name. The Pennsylvania State Police kept the case file active even as decades passed. Every few years, investigators would review the evidence, hoping that new technology or a fresh perspective might yield answers. In 2023, that persistence finally paid off. Investigators had received information from a confidential informant, someone who had knowledge about the case from 1975. The informant provided details that had never been made public, details that only the killer would know. Additionally, investigators obtained a diary entry written in 1975 by someone who was a 10-year-old girl at the time. The entry contained information that corroborated what the informant had said and pointed directly at David Zandstra. Armed with this new evidence, Pennsylvania State Police traveled to Georgia in July 2023 to confront Zandstra. He was 83 years old, an elderly man living in Cobb County. When investigators sat down with him and presented the evidence they had gathered, something remarkable happened. David Zandstra confessed. He admitted to kidnapping and killing 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington in 1975. After 48 years of silence, after building a life in other states, after decades of living as if nothing had happened, Zandstra finally told the truth. On July 17, 2023, David Zandstra was arrested in Georgia and charged with criminal homicide, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, third-degree murder, kidnapping of a minor, and possession of an instrument of crime. The arrest of an 83-year-old man for a crime committed when he was 35 made national news. It was one of the oldest cold cases ever solved in Pennsylvania. Delaware County District Attorney Jack Stolzheimer held a press conference to announce the arrest. His words were pointed and personal. "We are going to bring him here to Delaware County. We're going to try him. We're going to convict him," Stolzheimer said, "and he's going to die in jail." Then he added, "And then he's going to have to find out what the God he professes to believe in holds for those who are this evil to our children." Stolzheimer's comments reflected the community's fury. David Zandstra hadn't just murdered a child, he had been a pastor. He had been someone parents trusted with their children. He had been running a Bible camp, a place that was supposed to be safe, sacred, supervised. And he had used that position of trust to kill the daughter of a fellow pastor. Pennsylvania State Police Lieutenant Jonathan Sunderland reinforced the message that justice doesn't have an expiration date. Whether a crime happened 50 years ago or 5 minutes ago, the residents of the Commonwealth can have confidence that law enforcement will not rest until justice is served, he said in a statement. But bringing Zandstra to justice would not be simple. At his first court appearance in Georgia, Zandstra refused to waive extradition to Pennsylvania. This meant that prosecutors had to send a petition for requisition to Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, who would then forward it to Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. If approved, authorities would be able to transport Zandstra from Georgia to Pennsylvania to stand trial. The extradition process would take time, but prosecutors were confident it would succeed. During his court appearance, Zandstra stood before the judge using a walker. He was frail, elderly, and facing charges for a crime he had committed when he was still a relatively young man. The passage of time had aged him, but it had not protected him. The Harrington family released a statement through law enforcement. "The abduction and murder of Gretchen has forever altered our family, and we miss her every single day," they said. "We are grateful for the continual pursuit of justice by law enforcement, and we want to thank the Pennsylvania State Police for never stopping in their constant search for answers." Gretchen's father had died in the intervening decades, never knowing who had killed his daughter. But her mother and 3 sisters were still alive to see Zandstra arrested. For them, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and renewed pain. Relief that after 48 years, someone had finally been held accountable. Pain because no arrest could bring Gretchen back, and because they had waited nearly half a century for answers. As the case moved forward, investigators began looking at Zandstra's time in Texas and Georgia. They were concerned that Gretchen might not have been his only victim. Pennsylvania State Police asked people in Plano, Texas, and Marietta, Georgia, the communities where Zandstra had lived after leaving Pennsylvania, to contact them if they had any relevant information about him. District Attorney Stolzheimer stated publicly that authorities believed Zandstra may have sexually assaulted other victims. The fact that he had moved away from Pennsylvania so soon after Gretchen's murder, the fact that he had lived in multiple states over the decades, and the nature of the crime itself suggested that this might not have been an isolated incident. For the residents of Marple Township, the arrest reopened old wounds. Many people who had been children in 1975 remembered when Gretchen disappeared. They remembered the fear that had gripped the community, the warnings from parents to stay close to home, the realization that their small town was not as safe as they had believed. And they remembered that it had happened to a pastor's daughter, a girl who was simply walking to Bible camp. The case highlights several disturbing patterns. First, it shows how predators often position themselves in roles that give them access to children and the trust of parents. Zandstra wasn't just any community member. He was a pastor running a Bible camp. Parents sent their children to him, believing they were in safe hands. Gretchen's own father trusted Zandstra as a fellow man of the cloth. Second, the case demonstrates the importance of never giving up on cold cases. For 48 years, Pennsylvania State Police kept the file active. They continued to investigate, continued to follow leads, and continued to believe that justice was possible even as decades passed. When new evidence emerged, they acted on it immediately. Their persistence ensured that Gretchen's killer would finally face accountability. Third, the case shows the power of witnesses who come forward, even decades later. The confidential informant who provided information in the 2020s had carried knowledge about the case for nearly 50 years. The person who had written the diary entry in 1975 as a 10-year-old girl had preserved evidence that would ultimately help solve the case. Without their willingness to speak up, Zandstra might have died without ever being charged. The extradition process moved forward, and Zandstra was eventually transported to Pennsylvania to face trial. He has entered a not guilty plea, and his attorneys will have the opportunity to present a defense. But Zandstra's own confession, combined with the evidence investigators have gathered, makes the prosecution's case strong. At 83 years old, Zandstra is unlikely to survive a lengthy prison sentence even if convicted. Some have questioned whether prosecuting an elderly man for a crime committed 48 years ago serves justice or is simply symbolic. District Attorney Stolzheimer's response was unequivocal. There may be people who don't understand why an old man is being prosecuted, but make no mistake, this is an evil man. He was a predator. He's a wolf in priest's clothing, looking to attack. The symbolism matters. The message that justice doesn't have an expiration date matters. The acknowledgement to the Harrington family that their daughter's life mattered, that her murder was not forgotten, that someone would be held accountable, that matters profoundly. Gretchen Harrington was 8 years old when she died. She was walking to Bible camp on a summer morning in a small Pennsylvania town. She trusted the adults around her. She trusted that the pastors running the camp were good men. She had no reason to believe otherwise. David Zandstra betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. He took a child from her family, from her community, from the life she should have lived. He murdered her and left her body in the woods. Then he moved away, built a new life, and said nothing for 48 years. But investigations don't always close just because time passes. Families don't always give up just because decades go by. And sometimes, even after half a century, the truth comes out. Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Jonathan Sunderland's words at the press conference announcing Zandstra's arrest sum up the case perfectly. Justice does not have an expiration date. Gretchen Harrington has been gone for nearly 50 years. But she has not been forgotten. Her name is still spoken. Her case was never closed. And the man accused of killing her will finally stand trial, even though he is now an old man, even though decades have passed, even though he tried to hide in other states and other lives. The Harrington family waited 48 years for this moment. Gretchen's mother and sisters have lived most of their lives with an unsolved murder haunting them. They have endured birthdays and holidays and milestones without her. They have aged while Gretchen remained forever 8 years old in their memories and in the photographs they keep. Now, they will see David Zandstra face a jury. They will hear the evidence presented. They will have the opportunity to give victim impact statements if he is convicted. And they will know that law enforcement never stopped fighting for Gretchen. That persistence, that refusal to let time erase accountability, is perhaps the most important legacy of this case. Cold cases can be solved. Killers who think they've gotten away with murder can be caught decades later, and justice, while delayed, can still be served. As David Zanstra awaits trial in Pennsylvania, as prosecutors prepare their case and the defense prepares its response, one thing is certain: an 8-year-old girl named Gretchen Harrington walked to Bible camp on August 15, 1975, and never came home. For 48 years, her family and her community have lived with that loss. Now, finally, they have answers. Now, finally, they have justice within reach. Whether David Zanstra spends his remaining days in prison or dies before sentencing, the truth has been spoken. His confession is on record. His arrest has been made. And Gretchen's name will be remembered not just as a victim of a cold case, but as a little girl whose life mattered enough that investigators never gave up, never stopped searching, and never let time become an excuse for inaction. Justice does not have an expiration date. Gretchen Harrington's case proves it. Case 9. Flordelis dos Santos de Souza. In Brazil, Flordelis dos Santos de Souza was a household name long before she became synonymous with murder. She was a gospel singer whose voice filled stadiums and inspired millions. She was a Pentecostal pastor who preached about love, family, and faith. She was a federal congresswoman who had risen from poverty to political power. And perhaps most famously, she was a mother, not just to her biological children, but to more than 50 adopted children she and her husband had taken in over the years. Her story was the kind that made headlines for all the right reasons: a woman who had overcome hardship, built a ministry, and opened her home to dozens of children who needed families. She embodied redemption, generosity, and faith. Brazil loved her. Then on June 16, 2018, her husband was murdered, and the truth that emerged would shock a nation. Anderson do Carmo was 42 years old when he died. He was Flordelis' husband and partner in ministry, a fellow pastor who had worked alongside her for years. On that June night, he was shot 30 times in their home in Rio de Janeiro. 30 bullets tore through his body in an execution-style killing that was as brutal as it was personal. Flordelis called the police, hysterical and crying. She claimed that robbers had broken into their home and killed her husband. She presented herself as a grieving widow, devastated by the random violence that had taken her partner's life. The public mourned with her. Her congregation rallied around her. Her fellow politicians offered condolences. No one suspected that the grieving widow was actually the architect of her husband's murder, but investigators suspected something wasn't right. The crime scene didn't match the story Flordelis was telling. There were inconsistencies in her account, details that didn't add up. Forensic evidence suggested this wasn't a robbery gone wrong, it was a targeted killing. And the more investigators dug, the more they discovered a web of lies, manipulation, and family dysfunction hidden behind the public image of a loving Christian household. As the investigation progressed, a disturbing picture emerged. Flordelis had allegedly been planning her husband's death for some time. She had tried to poison him on multiple occasions, mixing toxic substances into his food and drinks. When the poisoning attempts failed to kill him, she allegedly recruited several of her children, both biological and adopted, to carry out the murder. On the night of June 16, 2018, the plan was executed. Anderson do Carmo was shot 30 times by people he considered his children, people he had raised and loved. The killing was carried out at Flordelis' direction, orchestrated by the woman who stood beside him in church and sang about God's love. Investigators discovered that Flordelis had even worn a device on her leg designed to simulate gunshot residue, creating false evidence to suggest she had been near to the shooting and corroborate her story about robbers. The level of premeditation was staggering. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of rage. It was a carefully planned execution. The motive appeared to be both financial and personal. According to prosecutors, the marriage had been deteriorating for years. Anderson had allegedly been trying to exert more control over the family's finances and the ministry. There were reports of domestic tensions, power struggles, and disagreements about how the household should be run. Flordelis, who had built her entire identity around being a mother and religious leader, allegedly saw her husband as an obstacle that needed to be removed. But what made the case particularly horrifying was the involvement of the children. Flordelis had adopted more than 50 children over the years, creating a massive blended family that she presented as a testament to Christian charity. Some of these children were now young adults, and several of them, according to prosecutors, had been manipulated by Flordelis into participating in the murder of the man they called Father. The arrests began in 2019. Multiple children were taken into custody and charged as accomplices in Anderson's murder. Some faced charges for pulling the trigger. Others were accused of helping plan the killing or covering it up afterward. The family that had once been held up as an example of Christian love and charity was revealed to be something far darker, a dysfunctional clan controlled by a manipulative matriarch willing to sacrifice anyone, including her own husband and children, to maintain power. Flordelis herself was not immediately arrested. As a sitting member of Brazil's Chamber of Deputies, she had congressional immunity that protected her from prosecution. For months, she continued to serve in Congress, attending sessions and voting on legislation while investigators built their case against her. She denied all allegations, maintained her innocence, and continued to present herself as a victim, a widow who had lost her husband to violence and was now being persecuted by authorities. But the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from co-conspirators, forensic evidence, and digital records painted a clear picture of Flordelis' involvement. In August 2021, Brazil's Chamber of Deputies voted to strip her of parliamentary immunity, clearing the way for her arrest. In a vote of 437 to 7, her fellow Congresspeople decided she should face justice. The woman who had once been celebrated as a symbol of faith and charity was expelled from Congress in disgrace. Flordelis was arrested and formally charged with masterminding her husband's murder. Prosecutors alleged that she had orchestrated the entire plot, manipulated her children into carrying it out, and then lied to police and the public to cover up her crime. Several of her children had already confessed to their roles and agreed to testify against her. The trial began in 2022 and captivated Brazil. Every day, news outlets covered the proceedings. The courtroom was packed with journalists, family members, and curious onlookers who wanted to see how the beloved gospel singer would defend herself. Flordelis maintained her innocence throughout, insisting she had nothing to do with her husband's death and that her children were lying about her involvement. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. They showed text messages in which Flordelis allegedly discussed the murder plot. They presented testimony from multiple children who described how she had manipulated them, convinced them that Anderson was a threat, and pressured them to participate in the killing. They revealed the poisoning attempts, the planning sessions, and the device Flordelis had used to simulate gunshot residue. They showed that in the aftermath of the murder, she had tried to blame others and had continued to manipulate her children to maintain the cover-up. The defense argued that Flordelis was being framed, that her children were lying, and that she had no motive to kill the man she loved. They pointed to her decades of charitable work, her ministry, and her public service as evidence of her character. They asked how someone who had dedicated her life to helping children could possibly orchestrate such violence. But the jury didn't buy it. In November 2022, Flordelis dos Santos de Souza was convicted of murder. She was found guilty of orchestrating her husband's death and of using her children as instruments of violence. The sentence was severe, more than 50 years in prison. Given her age, it was effectively a life sentence. Multiple children were also convicted and sentenced for their roles in the murder. The family that had once been held up as an example of Christian love was now fractured, with members testifying against each other, serving prison sentences, and trying to rebuild lives shattered by violence and manipulation. The case sent shockwaves through Brazil. Flor Delis had been more than just a public figure, she had been a symbol. Her story of rising from poverty, adopting dozens of children, and building a ministry had inspired countless people. Her gospel music had been played in churches across the country. Her political career had been seen as a triumph of faith-based activism. The revelation that she had orchestrated her husband's murder shattered that image. It raised uncomfortable questions about celebrity religious leaders, about the dark secrets that can hide behind public piety, and about how easily people can be manipulated by those they trust. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of children in large, chaotic households where one person holds absolute authority. Several of the children who participated in the murder were young adults who had grown up under Flor Delis's control. Psychologists who examined the case suggested that some of them may have been so thoroughly manipulated that they believed they were doing the right thing by helping her. They had been groomed over years to see Flor Delis as the ultimate authority, to believe her narratives, and to follow her commands without question. For Brazil's evangelical community, the case was particularly painful. Flor Delis had been one of their own, a Pentecostal pastor who preached about family values and Christian love. Her fall from grace raised questions about how churches vet their leaders, how power can corrupt even those who claim to speak for God, and how congregations can protect themselves from charismatic leaders who use faith as a cover for darker impulses. In prison, Flor Delis has continued to maintain her innocence. She has given interviews insisting she is the victim of a conspiracy, that her children betrayed her, and that the truth will eventually come out. But with a 50-year sentence and overwhelming evidence against her, her protests have fallen on deaf ears. Anderson, Du Carmo's family has tried to process the tragedy of his death and the betrayal by the woman he loved. He had spent years helping Flor Delis raise dozens of children, building a ministry, and trying to create something meaningful. He died at the hands of people he considered his own children, on the orders of the woman he had married. The cruelty of it is almost incomprehensible. The children who were not involved in the murder have had to grapple with the destruction of their family. Some have spoken out about the toxic environment in the household, about the control Flor Delis exerted, and about the warning signs they wish they had recognized earlier. Others have remained silent, trying to move forward with their lives away from the spotlight and the scandal. The case stands as a cautionary tale about the danger of celebrity religious leaders who operate without accountability. Flor Delis built an empire around her image: the gospel singer, the mother of 55, the pastor, the politician. But beneath that image was a woman willing to commit murder to maintain control, willing to sacrifice her husband and manipulate her children into becoming killers. It's also a reminder that public piety doesn't guarantee private virtue. Some of the worst abuses happen in places that claim to be the most holy, committed by people who present themselves as the most righteous. Flor Delis preached about love while planning murder. She sang about God's grace while poisoning her husband. She stood in Congress representing the people while orchestrating violence. The contrast between her public image and her private actions is staggering, and it raises a question that applies far beyond this single case. How many other religious leaders are hiding darkness behind their pulpits? How many other families are suffering in silence while presenting a perfect image to the world? Brazil is still processing the Flor Delis scandal. Her music, which once filled churches and inspired worshipers, is now tainted by association with murder. Her political career, which had been seen as a triumph, is now remembered as the rise of someone who was willing to kill to maintain power. And her family, the 55 children she claimed to love, has been destroyed by her actions. As Flor Delis sits in prison, serving what will likely be the rest of her life, one can only wonder what she thinks about the choices she made. Does she regret orchestrating her husband's murder? Does she feel remorse for manipulating her children into becoming killers? Or does she still believe, as she claims, that she is the victim in all of this? Whatever her private thoughts, the public verdict is clear. Flordelis dos Santos de Souza, the beloved gospel singer, pastor, and politician, is a convicted murderer. She recruited her own children to shoot her husband 30 times. She lied about it to the police and the public. She tried to use her fame and her faith as shields, and ultimately, justice caught up with her. Anderson do Carmo was 42 years old when he was murdered by people he loved on orders from the woman he married. His death was brutal, personal, and entirely avoidable. He deserved better. Brazil deserved better. And the children who were manipulated into participating in his murder deserved better. The case of Flordelis is a reminder that evil can wear a gospel robe, sing hymns, adopt children, and smile for cameras, all while planning murder in the shadows. It's a reminder to look beyond the public image, to demand accountability from leaders, and to remember that faith without integrity is just performance. And it's a reminder that eventually the truth comes out. Eventually, justice is served. Eventually, even the most beloved figures can fall when their crimes are exposed. Flordelis fell hard, and Brazil is still watching her fall, still processing how someone who claimed to represent God's love could orchestrate such hate, and still trying to understand how a family built on faith became a crime scene built on lies. Case 10. Robert Reeves. In Durham, North Carolina, Robert Reeves carried himself as a man of God. He was well regarded in the church community, respected as a bishop and pastor who seemed dedicated to helping young people find their way. When he opened his home to Stephen Randolph, a student at North Carolina Central University who was going through hard times, it appeared to be an act of Christian charity. Reeves and his sister let Randolph move into a spare room for $300 a month. To those who knew him, Reeves seemed like exactly the kind of mentor a struggling college student needed. Behind closed doors, however, a different story was unfolding. Randolph had met Latrice Curtis in one of his classes at NCCU. She was separated from her husband, and their relationship became intimate. On the night of January 29, 2007, Latrice visited Randolph at the home he shared with Reeves. The two had sexual intercourse around 10 o'clock p.m. After she left, Randolph went to a friend's home to play video games. Latrice called him later that night to discuss their relationship. Randolph returned home at 1:30 a.m. The next morning, he received a call around 9 o'clock a.m. from an unknown man. Hours later, Randolph heard about Latrice's murder on the news. Investigators found Latrice's body and began working backward to determine who had seen her last. Surveillance footage showed a vehicle near the scene, and they traced it back to Robert Reeves. When detectives brought both Randolph and Reeves in for questioning, they learned disturbing details about the household dynamic and Reeves's behavior. Randolph told police about the last time he'd seen Latrice, confirming their relationship and the timeline. In a separate interrogation room, Reeves claimed he had no idea why his car would have been captured on camera at 1:30 a.m. He said he'd gone to church that night and then returned home. But Reeves shocked detectives with an admission that came out of nowhere. He told them he had approached Randolph about starting an escort service and had asked the young man to expose himself so Reeves could take measurements. Randolph backed up this bizarre claim when questioned. The autopsy report revealed the brutality of what Latrice had endured. She had been stabbed nearly 40 times. The attack was personal, vicious, and sustained. At the same time, Reeves' alibi was crumbling. No fellow churchgoers could verify that he had been at church that evening. Investigators dug deeper to find the connection between Latrice and Reeves, searching for a motive behind such a violent killing. When DNA results came back, Randolph and another potential suspect were cleared. they were not a match. Reeves' results told a different story. He was a match to evidence found at the scene. The chances of it not being Robert Reeves were 1 in millions. Robert Reeves was charged with murder. The community responded in disbelief. He was well regarded and well respected in the church community. It sounded like it would have been so out of character for him. People struggled to reconcile the pastor they thought they knew with the man accused of such a brutal crime. As investigators continued building their case, they learned something that made the picture even darker. Reeves had a history of sexual misconduct in South Carolina and Brooklyn, New York, involving minor males. The pattern had followed him across state lines, hidden beneath his reputation as a religious leader dedicated to helping young people. At trial, prosecutors presented the overwhelming evidence against Reeves. The DNA match placed him at the scene. The surveillance footage showed his vehicle. His alibi had fallen apart completely. His own bizarre admissions about inappropriate behavior with Randolph painted a picture of a man whose outward appearance masked predatory tendencies. Reeves chose not to testify on his own behalf. He offered no explanation for why Latrice Curtis, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, had been stabbed nearly 40 times. He provided no defense for the DNA evidence or the crumbling alibi. The jury found Robert Reeves guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Latrice's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but it could never bring her back. She had been a college student working toward her future, navigating the complexities of adult relationships, trying to build a life. That life was stolen from her in an act of incomprehensible violence. The case exposed uncomfortable truths about how predators can hide in plain sight within religious communities. Reeves had moved from South Carolina to Brooklyn to North Carolina, his history of misconduct following him, but never catching up until it was too late. His position as a pastor, his reputation as someone who helped young people, his appearance as a mentor, all of it provided cover for someone dangerous. Stephen Randolph had trusted Reeves as a mentor and roommate. The church community had trusted him as a spiritual leader. Latrice Curtis had no reason to fear visiting her boyfriend's home. None of them knew about the pattern that had been building for years across multiple states. Today, Robert Reeves remains in a North Carolina prison, serving his life sentence. The name that once carried respect in Durham's religious community is now associated with betrayal and murder. Latrice Curtis's life was cut short at the hands of someone who claimed to represent faith and guidance. The case raises difficult questions about accountability within religious institutions. How does someone with a documented history of sexual misconduct continue to hold positions of authority in churches across different states? What systems fail to track this pattern and prevent him from gaining access to more potential victims? How many warning signs were missed or ignored before a young woman lost her life? Even today, Latrice's murder serves as a reminder that positions of religious authority can mask the most dangerous individuals. Background checks, information sharing between institutions, and willingness to investigate allegations, even against respected leaders, are not attacks on faith. They are necessities for protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit trust for predatory purposes. The fallout extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. It forced conversations about institutional responsibility, about the danger of allowing respected figures to move from place to place without accountability, and about the cost of prioritizing reputation over safety. One young woman paid for those failures with her life, and a community learned that respect and religious authority are no guarantee of character. What unites these 10 cases is a pattern of profound betrayal that strikes at the heart of faith communities worldwide. These individuals weaponize the trust that congregations place in spiritual leaders, transforming sacred spaces into scenes of violence and exploitation. From Charleston to Chile, From small-town churches to sprawling compounds, the common thread isn't denomination or geography, it's the devastating abuse of religious authority. Yet these convictions also remind us that justice, though sometimes taking decades, can pierce through institutional protection and public image. The courage of survivors who spoke up, investigators who refused to quit, and families who fought for truth demonstrates that even those who hide behind robes and Bibles cannot escape accountability forever. These stories force us to ask, how do we protect the vulnerable in faith communities while preserving the good that genuine religious institutions provide? Which case shocked you most? The celebrity jacket designer, the priest who escaped justice for 57 years, or the gospel singer who recruited her own children as killers? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this video eye-opening, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into shocking true crime cases.